My pleasure. And thank you all for being here so early. Hoping you can hear me. My voice will probably actually escalate as we get going. I tend to get a bit riled up. I have some props for you. One is for you, the rest can be circulated. Unfortunately, there's not enough for everybody to take home, but I'm hoping at least everybody can take a quick look at this during the lecture. I'll be speaking about the work that led up to this publication. If it really hits a nerve and you think it's central to a question that you would like to pursue in your own research, I do have more, and you can get in touch with me and I can give you a copy. But for today, this is all I could fit. So my name's Jeff, as Federico said. I've been teaching at the UFA for 8 years now. And when I first got to the UFA in 2017, I was primarily teaching undergraduates in the context of a program called cultural analysis, but with an emphasis on environmental questions. I was specifically hired to help build out environmental humanities in our curriculum. And at a certain point within a couple of years of teaching in that program, I realized that the traditional way for humanities students to study environmental questions was through cultural objects, novels, films, paintings, and so on. But that the kinds of questions that we were actually interested in pursuing and learning about required us to be out in the field. However, humanities students don't typically, at least in the programs I teach, literature, philosophy, and so on, don't typically have fieldwork as a fundamental component of their research practice, nor their pedagogy. And so there wasn't, with the exception of anthropology, of course, but there was not a lot of methodological orientation for me to pull on when I realized that actually we were studying questions of climate change, environmental justice, the relationship between fossil fuels, energy, and our cultural habits, that there are major transitions happening just down the road at the Port of Amsterdam, and that we could actually locate our inquiry in this field, this logistical field. But I realized we didn't really have a lot of tools to do that because we don't really do field work. So instead I asked artists and artistic researchers to help build out some templates to bring different kinds of researchers in conversation with one another in the field so that we could ask very different kinds of questions about the conflicts, the concepts, the promises, the desires, and so on of a given field. A field that is, I don't know if you've been to the Port of Amsterdam, is quite recalcitrant, by which I mean it's very hard to actually get located or oriented or feel comfortable in a space that is not really designed for people like us to just meander through and have a good time, right? It's designed with a set of functions, industrial functions, mostly that have to do with the containerization of particular kinds of materials as they move from one point in the world to another. That is to say, the Port of Amsterdam it specializes in dry and wet bulk, which is quite distinct from something like the Port of Rotterdam, which specializes in commercial goods and containers, right? So there's a lot of materials moving through the Port of Amsterdam, and you don't really, just by standing in or near the port, you don't really have a clear sense of what these materials are, what the magnitude of their transshipment through Amsterdam is onto other ports, mostly in Germany, nor do you have a sense of where they come from. A lot of the information that immediately you might want to acquire is not there for the taking simply by being in the field. Logistical spaces are designed to be, hygienic, that is to say, to not leak or spill too much, to varying degrees, of course, but also there are questions of proprietary knowledge, that is to say, the private companies who actually lease some of these spaces don't necessarily want competitors to know how much or how little of a given material that they have. And then there are also larger kind of state security questions when it comes to energy security, and also questions of legitimacy around acquiring and purchasing these goods. So the point I'm making is we wanted to ask about what the role of the Port of Amsterdam was in the larger questions of climate change and sustainability. We wanted to go to the Port of Amsterdam because we knew that it was a very central field where the transition was happening in literal material ways, but we had to get a little bit creative when it came to actually pursuing those questions, because simply by being there, we weren't getting those answers, right? Because it's not designed for people like us to be there. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so is really some of the ways that we kind of created these techniques for critical inquiry, but also for artistic collaboration in order to get a better sense of what's actually happening in this particular space. But we think it is portable to larger logistical spaces around the world. Some of the outputs, so one of them is the book that you're holding, but also a number of essays that you might take a look at if this is interesting to you. And some of the questions that we actually came out the other end asking. So different kinds of questions that we didn't expect to be asking at the beginning. I'll begin with an orientation device. An orientation device is a set of cues, very different ways of perceiving an object or a space, in this case, IJmuiden, which is about 30 kilometers west of the Port of Amsterdam. It is in many ways functionally contiguous with the Port of Amsterdam, but of course there's a lot of space between IJmuiden and the Port of Amsterdam. I think they're treated largely as discrete, regions, municipalities. I don't think Amsterdam has much management. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that the city of Amsterdam has a lot of direct managerial authority over IJmuiden at all. Though what I'm going to talk about today really is the expansion of the sea locks at IJmuiden and its impact on the Port of Amsterdam as a transshipment port. Hands up if you've ever been to IJmuiden, if you visited the sea locks. Okay. What was your experience, just anybody, what was your experience of visiting those sea locks? What brought you there in the first place? You sorry?
You can take the ferry to England from there.
True. Is that?
That's why I was there, but also to get like fish. You can get fish there.
It's true.
But like my general association, which might not be the nicest, but it's just ugly.
Yeah. I mean, it's not designed to be like an attraction, right? It's not attractive in the traditional sense. I think a lot of people who visit IJmuiden are there for business or to catch the ferry to Newcastle, for instance, or perhaps to jump over to the other side of the estuary. With the exception, I think, of maybe industrial tourism. There is a little bit of industrial tourism, so people who are interested in the engineering of the sea locks, or perhaps have an attachment to Tata Steel for whatever reason. Maybe they work there, maybe they're part of the union. But generally, it's not a space that's buzzing with curious spectators. And yet, it's the largest sea lock in the world. So from an engineering perspective, it's a fundamentally interesting, functional, and important space. So a sea lock, of course, is a set of interlocking spaces that allow for differential latitudes. So for instance, sea level to where we are in Amsterdam, for ships to move across those differential latitudes without dumping the entire sea into the Netherlands, right? So it's a way of strategically moving ships and cargo from one latitude to another. And in this case, because of course the Netherlands is so proximate to sea level, these sea locks actually had the engineers required a very particular kind of approach to managing the differential, not just the differential of water levels, but also, as I'll talk about in a moment, of saline levels. So a lot of salt is allowed into what is otherwise the brackish milieu of the estuary and inland into the polders and rivers of the Netherlands. And too much salt is a problem. It's a problem for all kinds of reasons. It's a problem for infrastructure. It erodes infrastructure faster, but it's certainly more centrally a problem for agriculture, right? So having salty water in the polders will be a disaster for the agricultural sector of this country. And so you can see why these sea locks at IJmuiden, and the question of how much water they let in and how much salt they let in is really important to the connective ecology of this country, and why therefore it required a particular kind of approach. But what I'm going to do is get us situated. You're going to hear a sound in a moment. The sound is a 8-minute track, a compilation of sound recordings captured by artists at the 1-week residency that I hosted 2 years ago called Field Arts. We situated Field Arts, this residency that I was talking about, where we needed to get artists together and philosophers and critical theorists and ecologists to come up with new ways of spending time doing field work in recalcitrant spaces like logistical fields. You're going to hear sound recordings. Most of them are captured by hydrophones. Hydrophones are microphones that you submerge into water, and they're incredibly sensitive, and they can, in fact, pick up signals communicated between microorganisms, which is what you're going to hear. You're going to hear microorganisms in 2 locations, one, the muddy estuaries of Texel, the other in IJmuiden, communicating with one another. You're also going to hear loud industrial bass notes. That's captured from one of the sea locks as we are waiting to move from one level of sea level to another, that is from sea to inland. And you're going to hear the actual sea locks themselves emitting sound waves into the milieu of water. You're also going to see a moving image on the left, on your left, which is a GIS. It's not live today. It was live in 2022, but a live GIS map of all ocean-borne or waterborne vessels on Earth during the moment of its capture. You could do the same thing right now if you went to marinetraffic.org. You could see at any moment probably between 200,000 and 300,000 GIS-located vessels on the planet, moving anything from fish to gasoline to coal to shoes on ships. You probably know that even to this day, anywhere between 85 and 95% of all commercial goods or commodities on Earth move from source destination to market via marine logistics, that is to say on ships. At some point, those goods will then, of course, find their way onto boats and trains and so on, but at some point they're moved around the Earth very slowly on ships, the vast majority of commodities. And that's why this map is so populated with marine traffic. But we're going to zoom in as we get oriented into the Port of Amsterdam. You're going to see what kinds of ships actually move through this sea lock into the port that we could ride our bikes to right now if you wanted to in about 40 minutes. And on the right, finally, you're going to see a slideshow of images captured by the participants in the residency as we started to notice some of the forms of life that animate and live this space. That is to say, give life to these various logistical spaces that are otherwise a bit ugly, right? A bit beyond the typical perspective of somebody living or visiting Amsterdam. The red vessels that you see are tankers, so ships that carry mostly oil, natural gas, and barges carrying coal. Green is our cargo ships. That cluster you see is IJmuiden, and the red you see is a heat map of traffic over time. So you can see the pathways, the currents of cargo. Tata Steel at the top. These are microorganisms touching the surface of the hydrophone. These are signals emitted by those microorganisms in very smelly mud in Texel. Here you see the density of tankers in the Port of Amsterdam. It's mostly what you would see in that maritime space, are tankers carrying bulk, either dry or wet. It is a deep water port. That is to say, that IJmuiden was expanded to support Panamax ships, which are ships that are built to the scale of the Panama Canal, the largest in the world. On the right, you see the participants at the end of a week of fieldwork, trying to write this book that you have circulating. Thinking about all the ways in which the hydrological milieu, the dense, lived medium of brackish water in the space connecting the largest sea lock in the world to the industrial port that is contiguous with the city that we live in, how that milieu sounds, tastes, what histories it remembers, what kinds of futures it promises, what forms of life in the estuary itself feel the transition, feel the energy transition, feel the expansion of the sea locks, feel materially the larger global logistical chain that the Port of Amsterdam is really a central node in. And then finally concluding at the library where we are sitting on the right writing this book. All this to say, we really wanted to think seriously about what does it mean to do situated inquiry, to situate ourselves as close to the lived density of an ecology, an industrial economy, a cultural history, to situate ourselves and to build out our knowledge from that point of situatedness. Quite distinct from the satellite eye view that you saw from marine traffic on the left. Though at the same time, we realized to think in a situated way about the Port of Amsterdam is to think about the global economy, since it is such a central node in that economy. And so this paradox of scale became really important for us. And you'll see in the book that we write a lot about moving kind of dramatically across scales and getting a little bit dizzy or disoriented as we think about the global image, right, which is a relevant image, the abstraction of the globe, and the kind of computational production of the image that you saw on the left, on the one hand, and then the really, the material, visceral, tactile stuff of IJmuiden itself, putting our hands in the water and walking on the beach and listening to microbes that you can't see if you're not listening or looking closely. What it means to move across these scales. We also learned a lot about brackish water, which was not the thing that we expected to learn about. But the particular milieu of brackish water is, for those of you, the Dutch people in the room will know immediately what that means. But brackish water, for those who don't know, is a mix of salt and fresh water. And there is a range that constitutes brackish before you get to either fresh or salt, of course. And brackish milieu are ecologies where particular kinds of species live and thrive. Brackish milieu are also often transition ecologies. There are a lot of the organisms and species that you will find in a brackish water are also species that are quite comfortable moving through that milieu from one to the other. We also learned that the city itself and the kind of water that really punctuates our daily life in a city like Amsterdam is itself brackish. That depending on what canal you're walking on, you might be looking at salt water or fresh water. And it also depends on the depth of the canal that you're looking at or maybe swimming in. We found this quite interesting to think about Amsterdam itself as a transition zone, as a brackish milieu. That the cultural life of the city both ecologically and sociologically, in a way is impacted by the ecology of its water, both historically as a colonial center, moving colonial goods from all over the world, but also in today's experience of the hydrology of the city, depending on where you might swim in the summer, what kinds of organisms you might see if you're standing and looking into the water, and also where some of those organisms come from. A lot of the organisms that you see in the canals of Amsterdam come from all over the world, because they arrive, of course, in the ballast water of these massive ships that come from all over the world into the port of Amsterdam. So a transition zone. We developed in conversation with a tradition called open plan fieldwork, which is a term developed by artistic researchers in the World of Matter collective. We developed our own technique for immersing in the Brackish milieu of this particular place by taking field notes, sound recordings, interviews. We also invited specialists like a Brackish ecologist, a benthic ecologist, to tell us about the benthic ecology of IJmuiden itself. Benthic ecology is like the organisms that live on the bottom of the seabed, mostly shellfish. And we developed new questions to think about this space in a way that we argued, asking questions about this space that we argued were not being asked in the kind of official language used to describe and legitimate the transition at the port. In other words, there was not a lot of artistic inquiry or critical environmental inquiry into some of the consequences of this expansion of the sea locks at the time, and we thought we should develop new questions that maybe don't have space to be asked in the typical conversations about this transition. One of them that we really got interested in was the question of currents. So to address this problem of scale that we encountered, the radically situated local ecological perspective and then the global logistical scale, we thought, okay, what brings these two scales together in the most meaningful material way? And we thought about currents as a potential orientation device to think about the convergence of those scales. Oceanic currents that carry matter and memory, temperature and pressure, saline levels, wind, and so on from all over the world to this particular place. So a very material hydrological concept of current, but also the economic currents that repeat or pattern the transshipment of goods from far off into this particular place, right? Those are materially continuous with one another, since maritime capitalism depends on currents and is moved by currents historically and in the present. And so there's a way in which the hydrological shape of the earth is itself a patterning of trade, and vice versa, since the scale of carbon emissions in the 19th and 20th century are now altering or impacting or potentially impacting the shape and magnitude of ocean currents through climate change. Vice versa, trade itself is also a way of patterning or writing itself into the hydrological currents, the ecology of the planet. So there's this reciprocity, this strange way in which the scales we're trying to think, the local situated and the global abstract, are themselves writing themselves into one another, right? So they can't be treated as separate. They can't be treated as a choice of scale. You can't just choose one and think about what is true there, but not true at the other scale, because they're reciprocal. They're writing themselves into one another. So currents became a really important concept for us to think about in order to ask better questions about environmental and social justice in the present. We also thought seriously about the ways in which global supply chains are typically infrastructures, processes, and spaces that scholars in the humanities don't have a lot of training thinking about, but actually are central to a lot of the questions that we typically ask about social and environmental justice. So we centered questions of supply chains, the history of supply chains, the shape of supply chains, some of the conflicts that supply chains carry from far off into this particular place. We centered that in our analysis, in a patterning of our own inquiry. A very simple example would be the question of why would the Port of Amsterdam require an expansion of the sea locks in order to facilitate increased transshipment of goods, right? What kinds of downstream and upstream players in the global economy facilitate that demand for expanded capacity? Where are these materials coming from, and how is the expansion of their quantity in some ways determined by business decisions in places like Amsterdam or London or Hamburg? In other words, how does the financial choreography of the movement of material from the earth onto ships through the supply chains that are marked by something like the Port of Amsterdam, how does that choreography impact the ecology of a space that we live in, right? So that's an example of centering supply chains in our inquiry, of thinking that like where the stuff comes from, where it is dug out, is not incidental to our daily experience of a space like the city of Amsterdam. It's not beside the point or incidental, it's actually central. Right? There is materials dug out of mountains and mines and dredged from various ecologies all over the world that are then turned into commodities, moved through supply chains, and arrive in this port. Right there, you can go and see it. And if you breathe the air as you're walking through some of these spaces, you are breathing particles from mines and extracted zones all over the world. It's material, it's present, it's literal, it's not incidental. That's what it means to center supply chains. We also talk to a lot of scientists who actually have different ways of asking questions about brackish milieu. At the NEOS on Texel, where we spoke with oceanographers and, in this case, a marine ecologist, we thought really seriously about how these sciences or disciplines actually, how they orient towards their objects. What kinds of methodologies do they bring to their inquiry, and what kinds of technologies do they use to actually study and capture their objects, especially microorganisms. And we took a lot of notes, of course, and had maybe a little bit too much fun, and then found our way back to a very different example of a brackish milieu at IJmuiden, and we thought, okay, in order to get better at asking the questions about how this particular node in the supply chain functions, how the choreography of finance capital actually moves matter across the world through spaces like this, we had to think with scholars who were doing some of the historical and critical inquiry in various disciplines, including planning. So on the right, you'll see some dear friends who wrote a special introduction to a special issue of Environment and Planning D, Society and Space, on essentially the logistical turn in the geosciences and in planning disciplines. I would very much recommend taking a look at this introduction and the work of all of these scholars, but in particular Charmaine Chua, who was our keynote at the end of this residency. But Charmaine's got a series of articles and essays about the politics of logistical spaces, specifically from a labor perspective, and she has a book coming out pretty soon on this work. We also invited Alejandro Colas, one of the co-authors of Capitalism and the Sea, to give the other keynote for the residency. And we learned about the history of maritime shipping in the expansion and sophistication of global capitalism. And the kind of peculiar but sort of fascinating fact that it's always been central, and we tend to think about contemporary post-industrial capital as dislocated or divorced from maritime logistics, but actually quite the opposite is true. Maritime logistics has never been more central to the functioning of the global economy. It is a very wet and heavy economy, more so now than ever before. On the right is my PhD student, Charles Rouleau, putting his hydrophone in the mud. That's what you heard at the beginning. He's writing a dissertation right now about acoustic milieu, that is to say how sound works in various ecological cultures between non-human actants. On the left, two artists who are thinking about how to address this question that you sort of raised too, about the ugliness of IJmuiden. Like, what does it mean to actually let the aesthetic impact of that space into your practice and how to engage with it meaningfully? So one thing we did was we took water samples, we tested various kinds of things, its saline levels and the density of particles in the water, and then we turned some of those samples into the base for watercolors, and then some of the artists were able to use that milieu-specific medium as the medium of their artistic representation. We also thought a lot with some of the artists who actually have spent time professionally in this particular logistical space, like my friend Natasha Libbert, who wrote an amazing book called I Went Looking for a Ship in 2018, where she spent, I don't remember exactly how long now, but quite a few weeks on a particular ship that was moving back and forth between a mountain in Norway, extracting granite, pink granite, which is why the ship is pink, and moving that granite from Norway, literally in the base of a mountain, back to the port of Amsterdam, where that granite was then offloaded, treated, and then moved to various industries all over Europe, mainly for transportation infrastructure like roads. And she thought seriously about, like, who are these people who work and live on these boats? Who are these people? How do they think about the world? How do they think about their work? What does it feel like to move between these two nodes in the supply chain back and forth, and to have a kind of intimate connection to the two landscapes that are so connected in such abstract ways through the movement of material, but to actually develop a material, intimate relation to those spaces. As I said, we also had conversations with scientists in this space itself. We learned a lot about the actual dynamics of salinity, both in the ocean and in the estuary, the I estuary, and what kinds of organisms like to live in these spaces and how they navigate very, very different orientations in salt versus freshwater. The density, the pressure, the temperature of salt versus freshwater is radically different. So what it means to be a body, to be a phytoplankton or a fish or a shellfish in one versus the other, is to feel the world as a fundamentally different kind of space. And this is something that also became really important to us, was milieu-specific inquiry. Milieu-specific inquiry is a term developed by the media theorist Melody Jew in the book called Wild Blue Media. I'm almost positive that's the name, Wild Blue Media. And milieu-specific analysis from Melody, it's a book some of you might find really interesting actually for your own work. It simply means that, like, we tend to think about the world as a universal space physically, that is to say, as bipedal creatures who stand and feel gravity and as a relative constant, with bodies that are relatively similar in shape and size, relative to other kinds of organisms like phytoplankton, right? We tend to think that the world kind of works physically in the exact same way, independent of who you are and where you are. That, like, gravity is a consistent, we are on the one planet, and while altitude might differ a little bit depending on where you're standing, essentially the physics of this planet is universal. And she says the second you start to do inquiry in a hydrological milieu, if you just simply get in the water, you realize that that's just not true. Like, how organisms navigate, how they feel space, how they communicate, how they orient themselves is radically different based on which milieu you stand in. And for those of you who have spent time at high altitude, you know that this is also true, that this idea that we have a kind of universal physical environment is also just not true even for us. Get in the water or go onto a high mountain, and suddenly the physics of your orientation is radically different. And this is true for the organisms that navigate and build home and culture in these brackish milieu as well. On the right, you simply see some of the plant life that marks the transition of a sea loch as it lets in salt water daily. So we didn't know what we would find when we actually immersed ourselves in IJmuiden, but we did get on a boat, and we spent 2 hours moving through the space, being in conversation with our captain, who was very invested in the industrial history of this space and the engineering feat of IJmuiden. And he informed us while we were on this boat that actually the largest of the 3 sea lochs wasn't open for use on the particular day that we were there. We asked why. We thought that was very puzzling because it was, by 2021, it was supposed to be open, and it was supposed to be the largest in the world. It was the king came and announced it open for business. So on the day that we were there, we were pondering why it would not possibly be open, what went wrong. And he told us that the mechanism by which the loch actually filters seawater, salt from the seawater back into the sea, that is to say, prevents the ocean from simply dumping salt into the brackish milieu, polder systems, rivers, and so on of this country wasn't working properly. That too much salt was being let in. At any given second, over 50,000 liters of salt water in a moment when the actual sea lock is opening and letting a ship through. In that process, at any given moment, 50,000 liters of salt water is let into the I estuary. And of course, it has to be filtered out somehow. Otherwise, we would simply be living in an increasingly saline environment, and that would be really, really dangerous for the agricultural sector, but also for our drinking water and so on and so forth. So it was closed, and in fact, it had been closed for quite some time. And I actually had a hard time figuring out over the past couple of days when, since 2021 to the present, when it has been open and when it has been closed. It's actually, it's very inconsistent. At the moment, it's closed until, I believe, the end of March for maintenance, though it's like 2 years old. So the point is that we realize that actually it's a very compromised infrastructure. And the reason it's compromised is actually this very situated ecological fact, which is that it's a brackish milieu, which is to say that it's sensitive to salt. So from an engineering perspective, a perspective that actually is an interesting perspective in that it does bridge the global and the local in a lot of ways, the engineering perspective somehow wasn't able to account for the dynamics of salt. Right? The milieu specificity of this particular space, this field, that is to say, the central function of salt, troubled the infrastructural imaginary of the engineers, and still does to this day. It simply can't function in the way that it's supposed to because too much salt moves through that space, altering the milieu specificity of the I estuary. And we thought that was really kind of, I mean, it must be very frustrating and I'm assuming very expensive. But also kind of fascinating that salt, this very humble element in the larger, supply chain of capitalism, this very humble element that defines the hydrology of this space, was actually the main player, the primary actant in the shape of our present and the shape of the future. Very quickly, I'll show you, I'll take about 10 minutes more, is that okay? Very quickly, I'll just show you how, for Dutch speakers, this will be much more accessible, how the engineers actually do selectively abstract, is the term, selectively abstract the salt from the water that's let in and let back out into the ocean. What I think is quite fascinating, and I think, for those of you who are maybe more interested in this part of planning, you might have some ideas about why this, the scale of this challenge was quite dramatic, actually. Might be quite loud.
Welkom bij het sluizencomplex in IJmuiden. Met in het midden Zeesluis IJmuiden, de grootste zeesluis ter wereld. Hier passeren grote schepen op weg naar zee of het Noordzeekanaalgebied. De zeesluis is een klapstaaltje techniek, maar er is een keerzijde. Er stroomt elke keer als er een schip door de zeesluis gaat 10.000 ton zout het Noordzeekanaal in. Dat zoute water is schadelijk voor de natuur, de landbouw en de productie van drinkwater. Om verzilting tegen te gaan bouwen we hier in het binnenspuikkanaal een zoutdam. En die werkt als volgt. Zoutwater is zwaarder dan zoetwater. Het zakt dus vanzelf naar de bodem van het kanaal. De dam houdt bovenin het zoete water tegen. Zodra overtollig water via het gemaal en de spuisluis wordt afgevoerd, stroomt het zoute water door een brede opening onderin de zoutdam terug naar zee. Dat noemen we het selectief onttrekken van zoutwater. Dat klinkt misschien heel simpel, maar toch moet er veel werk worden verzet. Zo wordt het kanaal flink verdiept. Vooral op de plek waar de zoutdam komt. Daar wordt het kanaal zo'n 12 meter dieper gemaakt. Maar liefst 800 meter aan damwand zorgt ervoor dat de oevers van het kanaal op hun plek blijven tijdens het uitgraven. Deze damwanden bestaan uit buispalen en damwanddelen die de grond in worden getild. Tegelijkertijd zetten we op het terrein aan de noordzijde pijlers en betonnen wanden van de dam in elkaar. Zodra we klaar zijn met het dieper maken van het kanaal, plaatsen we de pijlers van de dam. Uiteraard moeten die pijlers goed blijven staan. Daarom trillen we eerst palen de grond in. Met behulp van een kraanschip zetten we de pijlers exact op hun plaats. Hierna worden betonnen wanden tussen de pijlers gehangen. Laatste stap is het plaatsen van een brede stalen deur. Deze deur is onderdeel van de dam en kan open voor onderhoudsschepen. Het lijkt nu van boven alsof het kanaal geheel is afgesloten. Maar als je onder water kijkt, zie je onderin de dam een opening van 7 bij 80 meter. Hier stroomt het zoute water doorheen, terug naar zee. Zodra de dam voltooid is, wordt het zoute water direct gescheiden van het zoete. Zo voorkomen we verzilting van het Noordzeekanaal en beschermen we de natuur, de landbouw en ons drinkwater.
So that's the idea, and when it functions, that is how it functions. It's quite fascinating, but it often is not functioning. It's either too expensive, or it's eroding, or it's letting too much salt in. So I think actually for a lot of you, this might be an interesting kind of problem or challenge to think more about and to find out how engineers are addressing this today. At the moment, as you see, it's not actually functioning. So we moved then to the Port of Amsterdam itself, and we wanted to ask, okay, so we have a sense of like the connective logic of this particular logistical space, the sea locks, the larger global economy, and the port, but what actually is in the Port of Amsterdam? And how do we spend time there learning about it? So we literally just walked around. I mean, we did our research, obviously, but we also, I mean, I don't know how much of this I should actually, explain, but we definitely broke some rules. We didn't do anything necessarily criminal, but we spent a lot of time walking adjacent to these piles of matter, thinking about what they are and where they come from. And we got really excited actually about even the ugliness of this space, right? These are if you spend any time in the art world, you might recognize some of the symmetry between industrial shapes like these big mounds of matter and some of recent turns in ecological aesthetics to think seriously about these kind of post-natural shapes, these objects that come from industry but are full of natural materials. So instead of thinking just simply critically about some of the consequences of having large industrial piles of materials and fuels like coal in the Port of Amsterdam, we also wanted to think creatively about where these materials come from, what kinds of aesthetic play is available in the space itself, and also what is thriving in the Port of Amsterdam. So we collected a lot of flowers, we spent a lot of time with sheep, and we thought seriously about what is actually thriving in these sort of invisible industrial spaces. We then got together and collectively wrote a book. And the way we wrote this book was both through field notes that we collected over the course of the week in a shared document, but then in an intensive afternoon, we started thinking, okay, those of you who have the book will see that it's a docket, which is to say it's a list of concepts or encounters or images or phrases that we found in the field as particularly grounding. Concepts or devices or phrases that actually gave some specificity to this very particular field. And so what we did was that we drafted a list of the ones that we thought would be interesting for people who want to go in the future to this space and think about it creatively and critically. But we also decided to do this collectively. So each of the entries are written collectively by as many as 20 different voices over the course of an afternoon and then subsequent rounds of editing. Collective inquiry we thought was really important to represent the quality of experience that we had thinking about this space together. It is called Wild Blue Media. So I'm gonna try to wrap up by talking about some of the outputs here that you might take a look at if you're interested in pursuing any of these questions or this particular space. One is the book, of course. I also have a PDF, so I could also send that to you. The other is a white paper that's in draft form still, unfortunately, but I can share with you at least the provisional argument that was formulated. So this was written, as you see, in collaboration with a team of researchers, social scientists who were doing an extended project on fossil fuel supply chains across the globe. And they had a particular team focusing on the Port of Amsterdam. And we came together as a team of scholars and artists with their team who had been doing their own research on the financial and legislative envelope of energy transition at the port. And we compared notes, basically. You know, we thought, okay, what can we learn together? And what can we say meaningfully about this logistical space that plays such an important and ecological role in the larger environmental context of climate change, but also in the immediate life of us living in Amsterdam. You know, it seems such a central space for addressing many of the challenges that concern people who live here. What would it mean to have a meaningful relationship to it? And so we formulated this problem, which is that, as you probably know, the Port of Amsterdam has ambitions to be carbon neutral by 2050. And it's quite an ambitious target that it set for itself. But at the same time, it hasn't set any, I mean, at least in the last 2 years, correct me if I'm wrong, it hasn't set any binding goals to mitigate or even eliminate the transshipment of fossil fuels through its space. So as an actual entity, the Port of Amsterdam wants to be carbon neutral by 2050, but its function in the facilitation of fossil fuel transshipment from the global economy to Western Europe is not part of that ambition, right? They're treated as two completely different or distinct challenges as realms of law, and in fact they are. I mean, the white paper really tries to think sympathetically to how challenging that it would be actually to mitigate the transshipment of fossil fuels. At the same time, the city of Amsterdam is the primary owner of this space. It leases it out to private companies. And so our argument is essentially, first of all, there's a contradiction here, that the climate goals of the port are at odds with its economic function in facilitating transshipment of fossil fuels. So that's just a problem that needs to be sort of thought about more creatively, but also that the city might be a leader in trying to address this problem creatively by bringing the different stakeholders together. And so that was one of the outcomes of that collaboration. Another is a set of lectures, creative lectures, that I'm not going to show you now because we're out of time, but you can find a link to the one on the right via this QR code. And this was an event that we held actually at Ruigoord last year. And it was a series of lectures and workshops in the port itself. Those of you who have visited Ruigoord or know what it is, maybe have been there for a festival or something like that. But you will also know that it is literally beside an oil terminal in the Port of Amsterdam. It's a squatted village. It's been squatted since the 1970s. And we decided to situate this iteration. I hear some of you opening it now. And so I would invite you to pursue some of those lectures because they really are like a year later after the initial collaboration had expanded and individual projects had taken shape. A number of essays, a great number of essays, including this one, which I just published, which is about the kind of methodology that we developed in the field, and I'm calling it intentional field theory. This is available. I could send you a PDF if anybody is interested. And those are some of the outcomes. Last but not least, so I'd love to hear questions, accusations, comments, and so on about that work. And definitely, if you're thinking about that particular infrastructure space in your own work, I'd love to hear how you're approaching it and what you're finding interesting or challenging. But the last thing before I forget is I'm also part of a Horizon grant team studying, it's 8 universities across Europe, studying the role of industrial heritage, in particular in Western Europe, in navigating the energy transition. And it's centered on petroculture, so petrocultural industrial heritage. And the particular team that I'm part of at the University of Amsterdam is hosting a summer school this summer for scholars like you in a former industrial power plant in the small town of Luckenwald, which is about 30 minutes from Berlin. I mean, people in Berlin think it is in Berlin, but it's not. But it's very close. I could talk for hours about this space. I'll talk for 1 minute about this space. It's absolutely magical. The artist who took over this space, it had been dormant for many years, retrofitted the power plant, which was formerly a coal power plant, retrofitted it to become carbon neutral, using felled trees from a nearby forest. The only output from the production of power in this plant is a biodegradable soot that can be used to fertilize agricultural spaces. It's also a major exhibition space in the Berlin cultural milieu. Some major artists have exhibited there and will in the near future. But what it's trying to do is very interesting. It's trying to actually think seriously about its own architecture within a supply chain of energy as central to what it does, its contribution to conversations and the future of energy transition in its particular region, which is otherwise a very, it's like an AfD stronghold. So politically, it's a very dense space, right? It's very right wing, but it wants to think seriously, nonetheless, about the role of the art institution as an architecture, as a supply chain in energy transition, in relation to questions of inheritance and industrial heritage. And we think it's fascinating, and so we're going to host a summer school paid for 10 to 12 students, July 4th to 10th, to think about how to learn from what they've done. That is to say, some of the engineering insights that have developed from their experimentation with this retrofitted power plant, and to take that quite modest scale of an individual building and a local municipal grid, which is what it powers, and think about how that might be relevant for other players abroad at different scales. So how did they reimagine the supply chain of energy? What can we learn from that? And what lessons can other actors, planners, architects learn from this particular project? And we're going to write a book that sort of is like a kind of how-to using eWork as the case study. And I will send the link to the application on Friday when it goes live, but I would be super excited to see some of you apply, and it would be great to see some of you there in Luckenwald in July. Questions?